Goeiedag! Good day, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world.
I've been looking around for salvation. I've been looking around for the truth. All around me I see frustration, and I looked all over till I found you. I sit and listen to your stories, and you're telling me, please don't worry. Lot in this world you should know, and love in life is where you should go. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then love in life will guide you. I know that life outside is so hard.
Goeienaand, good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world. And my gosh, have we got some exciting news before I introduce our guest, Yusuf Ismail. I'd like to give you some feedback from last night's live stream, in which I spoke to General Isaac van Zyl following major heart surgery. After the live stream, I received an email from the winning bidder of the lion painting behind me. Let me show that to you. Okay. There you go. The winning bidder was Louis, and what he wrote blew me out of the water. He said he would pay the balance of Isaac's outstanding hospital debts, about 50,000 rand, leaving us with a target of about 130,000 rand to clear the final hurdle. To date, about 700,000 rand has been donated to cover Isaac's hospital costs, an amazing figure considering these hard times. I personally want to thank everyone who has donated to Isaac's hospital costs, regardless of the amount. The generosity of the Loving Life family is quite amazing. I fully understand that many are battling to survive, so could not financially assist, but your prayers played a huge role in this miraculous story. Our guest tonight is Yusuf Ismail. As you will see, he is a larger-than-life personality with an excellent legal perception on current events in South Africa. Yusuf Ismail is a trial court criminal defense attorney based in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, and works at Ikopo, the hometown of Alan Paton. He is the chair of the organization Lawyers for Constitutional Democracy, and further loves debating on global politics and religion, as well as contemporaneous, let me get that one right, issues. Yusuf has debated Christian philosophers such as William Lane Craig, biblical scholars like Mike Licona, and many others over the past decade. Before we start our live stream with Yusuf, this was seen, believe it or not, on a construction site in South Africa. Okay. I think that kind of tells a story, doesn't it? Now, let me get Yusuf on. Hi, Yusuf.
Hi there, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Are we live?
We're live, indeed. I can hardly hear you. Can you get your audio up a bit?
Let me try and get my earphones on.
Okay.
I'm going to get my earphones on the material here correctly.
Okay, Yusuf, I can hardly hear you.
I'm going to try and come slightly closer
That's
to the
a bit
screen.
better.
This is better. I don't know, for some reason, I think the sound doesn't seem to be too good.
Yeah.
But just tell me if the sound's bad on my side.
Okay, just talk. Just say something.
Well, what do I say? Dumelang, Saubona, Huenad.
That's better. Okay, that's better. Just
All right.
just keep quite close. Now, Yusuf, you are in Ikopo. I actually lived in Ikopo for several years.
Well, that's I actually work in Ikopo.
Oh, okay.
I stay on the south coast in Ovongo, and
Right.
I've been traveling for the past 3 years, back and forth. So I'm with the Justice Center Legal Aid South Africa,
Right.
that provides purely for the indigent people, and I've been there for about 5 or 6 years. Yeah.
Right. Now, can you move
Lovely
your camera
countryside.
down very slightly? I'm missing your mouth.
All right. I just want to try and let me just get here. All right. Sorry? Is that better? I'm in my pajamas, by the way. I mean, it's evening, so.
Too much information. That's much better. That's much better. Now, if everybody can hear Yusuf clearly, please just type 1 in the side chat. I'll just keep an eye open for that. Okay. So I spent about 4 or 5 years in Ikopo and used to work at the bank, Barclays Bank, at Umzimkulu Agency, which was quite an outpost. But remember the old Ikopo Hotel? Back in the 1970s, that's where I stayed. Now they've cut it in half, and the bottom is a store. I couldn't believe it.
I was not born in the 70s. I was not born in the 70s. And I mean, you're talking about Barclays Bank. I remember as a child going to with my dad to Barclays Bank in Durban. I know the FNB subsequently took that over.
Yeah.
But you're talking an entirely different generation, a whole generation.
Absolutely. I'm an old fart. Now, Yusuf, you are the chair for the Lawyers for Constitutional Democracy. What does this actually stand for?
Well, basically, it's an association. What had happened was, on the 27th of March, you had obviously the national lockdown that was imposed in South Africa by the president, and of course the formation of the National Command Council, which was seen by a number of legal practitioners, including myself, and you had academics. There were people like Professor George Devenish, who's well-known academic in South Africa. There were a few others, advocates, attorneys, and the like, and we thought to come together in a kind of on a voluntary basis as concerned and legally informed citizens of the Republic of South Africa. And in coming together, essentially, what we would say, what we would implicitly articulate would be the views of many South Africans, including various groups, individuals from different sectors of society, from varied race groups, from different religious and cultural backgrounds, many of whom are living in informal settlements. And the thrust of the formation behind this group was essentially to challenge and question government. And as early as March, by the way, when we questioned this, we received a lot of abuse on social media. The same people now who are globally questioning the whole basis of the lockdown back then were basically abusing us. Our main aim and objective was, we were saying that at this juncture, we needed to end the lockdown in the way and the manner in which it was imposed. And more particularly, a direct request from government in terms of providing legal, medical, and in many respects, the economic and of course, the rationale, the underlying rationale in terms of how this particular lockdown was in fact constitutionally unjustifiable. And obviously we've seen leading to a wide array of untold number of abuses, deaths caused by law enforcement officials, and a whole host of other issues at the same time. And so that was the broad ambit and thrust of this particular association. And so we sent a letter to the president. We didn't receive even the courtesy of a reply.
Well, that's normal.
Attached to our letter, normally they sometimes just simply give an acknowledgement that your request has been attended to.
If you're
But
lucky.
the thrust of our attack was, well, certainly if you're lucky, the thrust of our attack was so incisive and so clinical, more so than the De Beer judgment, the De Beer case, which obviously just simply focused on a few issues, that there was no response. There can be no response because attached to our 20-page letter, we had a 120-page documentation of medical and scientific data, in fact, showing that the trajectory that the government is in fact heading upon was totally wrong and totally and fundamentally flawed. So that's a broad ambit in terms of how this association, we're not funded by anybody. We did this on our own accord, and that was the historical basis in terms of how this association was essentially formed. Yeah.
Well, just touching on something that you mentioned there, which is what happened with the lockdown. I heard today that over 600 tenders, which were issued with that 500 billion rand, are now under investigation for misappropriation. Over 600. And this is after Ramaphosa had said, we will make sure that everything is done above board. Remember that famous statement he made when they got that 500 billion rand?
And that was in March and subsequent to that. And then there was an about turn in June or July, if I recall, where he says that now we will leave no stone unturned in terms of basically investigating these. So I mean, what amazes me is that people could not see the cynicism behind the whole thing. And I mean, I knew from the outset. I mean, on the 27th of March, and in fact the days before going ahead, there were a few people that were opposing it. And I knew that under this government, obviously we can talk about the global saga itself, but under this government, inevitably, when there's money involved, there's going to be wholesale theft, wholesale corruption.
Yeah.
But more particularly, as many people said then, we know much more now. When you've got a medical crisis, when you've got, for example, a crisis where there is a potentiality that you're going to have swathes of people are dying, it does not make sense to invest billions of rands in an army with guns pointed at the population. I mean, how do you solve a medical crisis through the imposition of creating a police state? It doesn't basically make sense whatsoever. And so, therefore, lots of jurists, and we questioned this at the outset, is that and this was in March, not now, back in March was the pandemic dealt with under the Disaster Management Act, which seemed in the broadest ambit. If you look at the Disaster Management Act, and this comes back to 2002, and of course the amendments now, by its nature, it seems to be reserved for national disasters. I mean, for example, if you had earthquakes, you've got, for example, a national disaster, tsunami, climate-related or human-induced disasters with wars. In that circumstance, obviously, you'd call in the army and so on and so forth, and steps would be taken. But the sinister question which we were raising is that what were the reasons as to why a declaration of national disaster occurred, which led to a litany of constitutional violations, whilst the Disaster Management Act, by its very nature, doesn't, in fact, does contemplate dealing with a disaster without declaring a national state of disaster. And so, in a broad manner of speaking, there didn't seem to be at the outset, Scott, any kind of rational connection between the regulations And I think that was that, and that's why the attack. When you look at all these so-called concerns, even if you look at the De Beer judgment, which is not a very good judgment, by the way, and the attack by De Beer, Reno De Beer, by the way, was just simply on one or two aspects, but not looking at the core. Our aspect was that the National Coronavirus Command Council, at its fundamental core, had absolutely no legitimate or constitutional right to existence. And so, on that basis, if it has no constitutional or legitimate legal existence, then by its nature, de facto, all the laws and all the regulations that are thereby imposed under this illegitimate entity are de facto null and void. And there's no response to that. There can be no response to that because there's no legal argument countering or rebutting that. Unfortunately, if you look at some of the recent High Court judgments, like in the ESO application, which was in the Western Cape High Court and is now going to the Supreme Court of Appeal, the judges, I think, I can't recall the judge's name. There were two judges in that case. They've adopted a very prudent, cautious approach and not applied the law on the basis that they maintain this whole position that the judiciary should not get involved in the determination of policy. But what we are saying is that it's not just simply a policy issue. This is not policy. This is a violation of the Constitution.
Right.
And if you, on the one hand, maintain that the president has the obligation to uphold the Constitution as the supreme law of the land, any appointments that the Constitution, that in fact goes against the Constitution or is against, it's basically against its own legislative existence, has to be set aside. There's no other way to describe that. Yeah.
Now, Yusuf, I just want to address the side chat. We've got about 250 people watching us right now. For those of you who are joining us at Loving Life for the first time, welcome to the family. We are a community here, and we're a very happy community. Please remember to subscribe to be kept informed in the future. We have live streams most nights like this. And thank you for all the spanners who are here. I see Marlena's here. Good work, Marlena. Now, getting back to you, Yusuf, you mentioned the army when you were just talking back then. Do you really think it is an army? I mean, there are only about 3,000 members of the army that can actually be conscripted, that can actually be brought together. And that's directly from Ian Cameron, who used to be in charge of safety and security for AfriForum. He said it's not an army. He said it's a complete and utter joke. And this is why you had those incidents that happened in some of the townships, because they aren't trained. They're just vets, a lot of them, who just think the whole thing is a big party. And the other point that you raise is Reno De Beer's application in the court, which was successful. Let's get back to that a bit later. What I just want to get back to is what are the aims and objectives of Lawyers for Constitutional Democracy?
Well, basically, our essential aims and objectives in relation to the lockdown, number one, is consistently and persistently requesting the office of the president. Well, in the present context, I'm saying that it was formed particularly, one could argue, as a response to the present pandemic, but obviously it's going to mature into dealing with other constitutional issues. At this particular point, what we are basically seeing or seeking is essentially asking this government and the office of the president a rationale in terms of explaining what constitutional power, government policy can be delegated by the president to a body that de facto has absolutely no legitimate legislative or constitutional existence. And essentially, what we're also arguing is that decisions taken by the president in a general sense, in terms of legislation, if it has legal consequences, I think Section 101, subsection 1, has to be in writing. This has to be countersigned by another cabinet member if decisions concern a function assigned to that cabinet member. And in this context, these requirements were never fulfilled in the appointment of the legitimate NCC. Now, this is on a very narrow level, where we are as a body seeking to suggest or ask what piece of legislation or constitutional provision as a president or any other body or the Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma cite as conferring upon him or her the power to appoint the NCC. But in a broad sense, hopefully, we are basically, or at least would hope to, and we are a Lose Association, seeking to ensure that at the very outset, the Bill of Rights and certainly the provisions in terms of what is contained in the Constitution be obviously upheld, and that the spirit and the ambit of the constitutional so-called democratic republic obviously be in place. And in a situation where, for example, South Africans are faced with more draconian and dictatorial regulations, because they are going to happen and they are going to come, then as a body, at the very least, we should be there present in terms of making a potential constitutional challenge to this and other regulations that are basically in place. So it's a loose association, which we basically believe to keep government in check and to ensure that it doesn't violate fundamental constitutional provisions and certainly the Bill of Rights of individuals. That's a broad ambit of the association. We are, however, and maybe I may introduce you at some point in time, we are obviously in I wouldn't say partnership, but we have a loose association, a loose memorandum of understanding with other organizations such as, for example, the anti-treason movement. You may not have heard of them, which seeks to, for example, argue the point that, treason by its very nature is something whereby individuals were regarded as committing treason against the state. And the whole flawed approach is that in a general sense, the state is not government. The state is actually the people. We, the people, are the state.
Exactly right.
And so when you've got a body of politicians and corrupt officials and a government, an entity that essentially engages in attack or wholesale violation of the rights of people in a general broad sense, then the question we're asking, and that body is certainly seeking, is that can they, of course, be liable for treason? Can they be guilty of treason? Can government be obviously guilty for treason? And by that we mean obviously the representatives of government in a broad sense. So that's basically the ambit in terms of which we are looking at, and of course creating at least a discourse and an awareness amongst ordinary South Africans in terms of the level of our attack pertaining to certain violations that we clearly see that happen. The other point which I need to bring to your attention, Scott, which people don't know, is that people talk about this 3-month so-called leeway in terms of Section 27.5 of the Disaster Management Act, and obviously this constant extension that needs to be brought into cognizance.
Right.
Section 27.1 of the Disaster Management Act states categorically that a disaster may be declared if existing legislation or other contingency arrangements don't cater adequately for a disaster, and obviously there are specific circumstances that warrant the declaration of a national state of disaster. Now, at the time when this was invoked, we already have regulations in place. We've got, for example, an act called the International Health Regulations Act 28 of 1974. It's certainly an old legislation, but in this particular act, there are a list of 32 ailments, sicknesses, which can be invoked in terms of this specific act. And what the supplementary regulations in a broad term, it prescribes essentially health measures and special provisions relating to, for example, primary infections. Now, the point is that in terms of this particular regulation, if it was invoked by government when they had this whole problem of the coronavirus allegedly happening, none of these interventions in terms of this act would have allowed for the suspension of constitutional rights that has been, up until now, the feature of some of the regulations promulgated under the Disaster Management Act. And so the point is that in a roundabout way, it's clear that the so-called pandemic could have been adequately addressed by the International Health Regulations Act, as opposed to the Disaster Management Act,
right,
whereby they, in a manner of speaking, are declaring a state of emergency without fulfilling, because if you look at the Disaster Management Act, you don't declare a state of emergency. It's a declaration of a national state of disaster. But in a roundabout way, they are imposing things like a curfew and the army controlling where people in the first initial week, which would have been done under state of emergency. But we were not under state of emergency. But to show and basically declare a state of emergency, the conditions are far more stringent. So in a roundabout way, they sort of imposed rules and regulations which would ordinarily have applied under state of emergency. But they did it in a devious fashion without necessarily fulfilling the terms and the provisions and, of course, the stringent means that would be necessary for that to be declared. And so they did this in a roundabout way.
Yeah. Now, Yusuf, I have to say that you've raised so many points that I could ask questions about. But before I address the side chat, I just want to say, when we talk about the NCCC, with members like Dlamini Zuma, Cyril Ramaphosa, Bekesele, I think the average IQ in the room is below 50, and I think that's the number one problem. But we'll get back to that in a minute. Getting back to the side chat, guys, if you've got questions you'd like to ask Yusuf, please just put them in the side chat, and I'll get one of the moderators to copy them, and we'll put those to Yusuf later. Now, let's move on. I mean, we're going to be discussing a whole lot of shit here because, I mean, the lockdown, for example, the whole basis of the lockdown. But before we do that, there's a elephant in the room, and that is the coronavirus itself. Is this a legit reason to lock down the world? But we'll get back to that in a moment. Let's look at the basis of this lockdown. Why did it happen? Not just in South Africa, but around the world. Who was behind it? Why was it invoked on people? And why were countries like Sweden, that did not have a lockdown, save their economies, and yet they didn't have this disaster that we're told we would have if we didn't have a lockdown?
Well, you know, that's a loaded but an extremely important question that you raise. And I think a lot of people are speaking about the so-called creation of an Orwellian society. I mean, if you look at, for example, I don't know if your readers or viewers have read Aldous Huxley's Brave New World or George Orwell's 1984. You see, in a sense, a kind of a growing movement globally and a kind of a pattern towards a so-called totalitarian tiptoe. And I
agree.
You know, at one point, you know, this was in the domain of conspiracy theorists, where you had certain individuals, and of course, a lot of the presentations that was given by them, you know, was in certain instances far-fetched. But when you look at the kind of fascism, which can clearly be seen fascism, and you look at the definition of fascism, I mean, all that you see around the world has the hallmarks of global fascism. I mean, who would have thought in 2019, did you ever contemplate that in 2020 we would have a society where, not just in China or, you know, probably some of these rapacious regimes, but globally, all over the world, that at one particular point in time, people are now shut down in their houses behind closed doors, and if you walk outside, it becomes a criminal offense. I mean, that's why I made it a point that even under lockdown level 5, I made it a point that you know, I live not too far from the beach, and going on the beach was in fact a criminal offense. I made it a point daily, because I'm not too far away, that I went to the beach on a daily basis. I was stopped once or twice by policemen who were sheepish, but in many parts of South Africa, people were arrested.
Yeah.
But I mean, this raises a question that people are not asking. I mean, what amazed me is that when Ramaphosa, and I mean not just Ramaphosa, but a lot of world leaders made the declaration, you know, those people who generally you know, were so hostile towards the ANC about corruption, and of course rightfully so, overnight they started congratulating him. They started basically lauding him for what he had done. And you mentioned Sweden. I mean, the one individual that comes to mind from Sweden is one of the medical advisors. I want your viewers to go and check Professor Johan Gisige, who was an advisor to the World Health Organization, and lots of other epidemiologists, Professor Nat Witkowski, you had the Erickson brothers from the United States and so on, that according to the data from most of these countries and regions, the lethality of COVID-19 is on average approximately 0.2%, which in a broad sense is in a range of a severe flu, or about 20 times lower than originally assumed by the World Health Organization. What is also quite amazing for the first time is this. I was just listening to SAFM about two days ago. You know, SAFM, our national radio station, and they made the point, which immediately triggered alarm bells to me. The fact that for the first time in South Africa, which is unheard of and which doesn't make sense whatsoever, that they made the claim that we've never had a flu season. Now, I mean, this doesn't make sense.
That's crazy.
This doesn't actually make sense.
Yeah.
We've never had a flu season. I mean, and the point being made now is that if you look, and of course we can unpack the very nature of the RT-PCR tests, which are used to basically conduct, you've got I'm not a medical expert, and I'm not purporting to put forth my information as a medical expert, but I'm looking at what medical experts have stated. There's a whole range of coronaviruses. If you look, for example, at the common cold, that's a coronavirus. The common flu is a coronavirus. When you look at the RT-PCR test that is being conducted on coronaviruses in general, they test for the genetic material. And more particularly, from a theoretical point of view, if you are sick, your body gives off exosomes, but in the general sense, it'll pick up a coronavirus in general and not COVID-19 in a sense, which to this particular day, there's been questions of whether it has indeed been isolated. So the question we need to ask is that is the high figures or the positives that we are basically getting in the South African context and other parts of the world, not possibly also as a result of the common flu, which is now being basically registered on the radar as individuals having COVID-19. I mean, yeah. I'm in a court right now. I'm in a court. I work in the regional court. My prosecutor 2 weeks ago, he fell ill with the flu. And he said it was a mild symptom. He's back in court. I met him. I spoke to him today. When he went for the test, he was tested positive for COVID-19. We have a situation increasingly, which people need to ask, where individuals are going to hospitals. They're going for ailments, for example, such as heart pains, anginas. Some are dying, for example, in casualty. Tests are conducted, and then they are tested positive as COVID-19. Now, I mean, automatically, this has to raise alarm bells. And I mean, one of the academics in South Africa, Professor Glenda Gray and Professor Shabir Mahdi, both have raised this point, that you had a situation where a baby, for example, in South Africa was diagnosed as COVID-19. And this was basically put forth in the mainstream media. But it ended up that eventually the health practitioners simply assumed, by virtue of the fact that the mother was purportedly positive, that the baby had remained positive. But even if if we could grant, for the sake of argument, the reality and the actuality of the so-called tests, that people are indeed testing positive, although there are significant negatives, and these tests are not specific. But let's, for the sake of argument, playing the devil's advocate. I mean, even amongst 70 to 79-year-olds, approximately 60% remain asymptomatic, and about, they say 95 to 96% of all persons show mild symptoms at all. I mean, the median age of the deceased in most countries is over 80 years, 70 to 80, and obviously the age and the risk profile of deaths, essentially, they would correspond to the kind of normal mortality. But I mean, it raises a question where suddenly, as a blue out of a miracle, something which has never happened, you have a situation where the flu season doesn't exist. And I mean, no one is trying to run down deaths, because even in the so-called COVID-19 deaths, it's often unclear whether they died from the coronavirus or if they were counted as presumed deaths and not tested at all. Because you have a situation where now increasingly on the death certificates, and I've seen them personally, where you are saying people are dying having tested of COVID-19. And that would now be viewed as a COVID-19 statistic. And many media reports of young and healthy people dying from COVID-19, have shown to be either false or totally inaccurate, because you have situations where people are dying of undiagnosed leukemia. but they are testing positive for COVID-19, and that is now being viewed as a reason for this. And what is amazing is when we're challenging these issues and there's no response. I saw the opposing affidavit by the minister to the ESO application.
Right.
It's a pity I never sent it to you. It was an absolute abortion. And that's why, for the life of me, I cannot understand why the application in the ESO application, which sought to suggest that the NCC is totally illegitimate, why that was not, in fact, set aside.
Right.
And hopefully in the Supreme Court of Appeal, that decision and more rational judges will obviously make that determination.
Now, Yusuf, I just want to raise a couple of issues on a lighter note. One of the iconic videos that I saw over the last few months was a young woman, a long-distance runner, running along the beach, and you see this policeman going down to arrest her because she's on the beach, and she literally runs around him, and this guy must weigh about 300 pounds. So he takes off after her, and he goes about 20 yards, and he gives up.
Is that the one where the Rocky theme, right? Is that the one where the Rocky theme is played in the background?
I think so, yeah.
I think I saw something like that, yeah.
And the other thing I'd like to just mention here is regarding vaccines. I mean, we here in Australia had a statement by our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, who said everybody is going to be forced to have the vaccine. And the resulting outrage was so great that he had to retract the statement and said, look, you don't have to, and I apologize for saying you do have to. Now, when we talk about this vaccine, don't you think that that's actually the end game? That's actually the elephant in the room is this vaccine. This whole thing with the lockdown, with the coronavirus and all that sort of stuff is really just playing mind games around the world. But when it comes to the vaccine, that is really what they want to do. That's what they want to achieve, and that makes me very, very concerned when you look at the shit they put in vaccines. What are your views on that?
Well, I'm not an expert in vaccines, and I've never taken a position either pro or anti-vaccine. I've got a 4-year-old child, a little baby. I think besides having vaccinated him once or twice, we decided collectively not to vaccinate him. I think the vaccine may be one of many aspects of the end game that's in place. I mean, I don't know if I should have sent you a video of artificial intelligence that is now being incorporated in society. I don't know if you've seen the image in the United Arab Emirates of this human robot.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
You have seen that.
I have.
I mean, that's like Terminator and RoboCop entering the reality of our society today. And apparently that's a killing machine. You've got a killing machine there. So I think the vaccine is one of many issues that we need to be concerned about. There's an interesting doctor called Dr. Andrew Kaufman, who is, he's a biologist. He's got some degree of information in psychiatry, and he made the telling point that in the vaccine itself, with the introduction of, for example, certain substances that are then introduced into the body, they have the possible ability to change the genotype of the human being. And I think that's concerning, particularly when you're talking about changing the genetic makeup.
You don't play with God's creation. That's the bottom line.
It's like these animals. When you inject animals with hormones, they different. They different. The beef, cattle, or fowls or roosters with hormone therapy to fatten them up. They eventually end up being different. They get more sicker easily. They are prone to ailments, and if eventually it changes the makeup of them. I mean, like, for example, plants and vegetation. And there is a talk that, which I'm concerned about, which I've seen, is a discussion on the vaccine passport.
Yes,
which is
the immunization passport.
And the immunization passport, which would mean that if you don't have the vaccination,
you can't travel.
you won't, well, besides not even be able to travel, you may not be able to enter a store for purposes of purchasing food. You
Yeah.
may not be able to go to work. I mean, I've got a situation now, well, maybe I should not mention it, but where, in the legal fraternity, we're not allowed to interact with our colleagues. We divided in groups because of the fact that there's a potential for spreading the ailments with each other. And the problem with that is that there's this inherent paranoia. But you know what's more concerning to me? The concern is not so much these individuals at the top that are wanting to introduce a nefarious agenda. The concern is an acquiescence and laid-back population
Yes.
that would be more than willing to go ahead with the narrative. And I think that's a danger, because what happens is you create a situation whereby there then becomes a mass consensus in society, where you have a situation where you don't need a wolf to police the sheep or the sheepdog to police the sheep. You'd have the sheep and we as human beings to outdo the sheep in policing ourselves. So we would basically report, and I mean, we've had situations here. I mean, just to give you an example, walking down the road, I had a situation many times. I walked down the road, and this was under lockdown level 5. I just decided to walk down. And you'd have neighbors that would basically, well, what would you call them? Pimp you out to the police, and then the next a few minutes you'd see a police vehicle that parks by next to you. So the danger that I'm concerned about is this: is that you have a situation where the population would be more than willing to go ahead with the so-called agenda. I mean, look at the society we have today. I mean, I'll give you the example of the face masks. There's many medical experts and surgeons that have pointed out that there's no scientific evidence for the effectiveness of face masks.
They don't work.
Or asymptomatic individuals.
Yeah.
I mean, the germs are so
They're tiny.
They're tiny, and I mean, in a surgery setting, I can understand why a doctor would have a germ to prevent saliva when he's operating under theater, and then of course they remove them after probably an hour or two. When you basically are wearing a mask and you go to the toilet, where you not only get germs but fecal bacteria, and then you put it down, which we do all the time, and then you put it on again. I mean, you are carrying germs with you. You are basically carrying, and besides that, I mean, hypoxia, where essentially you're breathing out, you're breathing in carbon dioxide in a situation. And what happens? I mean, when you're not in a place. I don't know about Australia. I don't know if this is the case in Australia, but in South Africa, certainly, we can't enter a mall to shop. You can't enter a store without a mask. You can't enter a bank without a mask. I mean, fortunately, in my court, where I operate, I've got a magistrate who's kind of more reasonable, and we don't wear masks in court. I mean, obviously, we try and maintain distance from the accused. But there's a cynicism. Scott, I need to point out a cynicism behind this. The audacity and the nerve behind government to say, look, you need to maintain social distance, you need to wear a mask. When you don't do that, you are, as has been cases of individuals arrested on the beach, what happens? You are then dumped into a van with a number of prisoners. I mean, go to our prisons in South Africa. Go to New Prison. Go to Westfield Prison if you've been in KZN. There are 70 to 80 to 100 people in one cell. I mean, the social distancing is a total impossibility. It will never happen.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's exactly the point. Now, just on that point, Yusuf, I just want to quickly just interrupt you for a second. Okay, now just addressing the side chat, we've got about close to 400 people watching right now. Please remember to subscribe to the channel to be kept informed, and I trust you're finding this discussion very enjoyable and informative. I am. And please, if you have questions for Yusuf, just put them in the side chat and we'll put those to him later. Now, Yusuf, you raised something, and this is the issue I have about this whole vaccine debate. Okay, first thing is that every year we have, as you said, the influenza that comes along, and every year they've got to bring out a new vaccine because the flu virus mutates. So having a vaccine for the coronavirus is stupid because it mutates. So once it's mutated, that vaccine is not going to work. Now, there's a much simpler solution. If you dare mention it on YouTube, you have your video taken down. And many doctors, in fact in France, it's now been adopted as a very practical way of defeating the coronavirus if you're very early in the infection stage. And that is a drug called hydroxychloroquine, which is normally used for malaria, for stopping malaria getting to you. And a combination of hydroxychloroquine and zinc has been confirmed by several doctors in several parts of the world to be a very simple way to shut down this virus within 5 to 7 days. Because what the drug does do is it stops the coronavirus from replicating, and it's because it replicates so fast inside the body that's where the problems come. So if you stop it replicating, it can't do anything, which is exactly what this cocktail of drugs do. Now, why is the World Health Organization and the so-called medical experts ignoring this particular cure, which totally obviates the need for a vaccine? And the other point I'd make is that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who've been pushing for this vaccine, they have several patents which date back to the early 2000s for coronavirus vaccines. Not many people know that. There's a lot of stuff that's gone on behind the scenes here that just makes no sense.
Scientists actually became interested in and look, I'm not a pusher for hydroxychloroquine. I mean, I've heard that. First time I heard it when Trump mentioned it. I mean, but he mentioned other bizarre things as well at the same time. But hydroxychloroquine, there was an in vitro study lab, I think, in China in February, as early as February, by the way, which in fact showed some sort of positive, promising results in combating COVID-19. And the drug was in fact shown to have anti-inflammatory and antiviral properties,
right?
Which essentially showed promising signs in animals. I think the rush in your country, for example, Australia, and I thought in Australia and the US, there's been talk about stockpiling the drug, which is previously best known as a treatment for malaria, and possibly, I don't know, but one of the reasons why we don't have, there hasn't been a massive explosion of COVID-19 in Africa, strangely enough, even at the height of COVID-19, and is it possible that people are on treatment for malaria, and accordingly,
exactly,
this had a side effect in terms of, to basically build up a resistance in relation to that. But I mean, my whole aim would be is that as opposed to simply prescribing drugs, I would say, build up the immune system. I've got a friend of mine, Alan Warnitz, he's a nutritionist. And his whole aim is that, that why is there so much of talk about supporting pharmaceuticals with this drug or that drug? Why is there never a discussion in terms of, in fact, not going there in the first place, keeping the body stable, building up your immune system, and then the necessity of medication would simply fall away.
But the reality is,
obviously, you'd have
the reality is, Yusuf,
the pharmaceutical industry would collapse.
The reality is, Yusuf, that there are a lot of people in South Africa who depend on drugs because of TB, HIV/AIDS, and things like that, that compromise exactly what you're talking about. My point with hydroxychloroquine is that it is a cure. Once you've actually got the virus, but you start taking this hydroxychloroquine, and within 5 to 7 days, it's gone. Because it can't replicate inside the body, because of the zinc apparently stops it from being able to replicate. Now, that obviates the need for a vaccine, because you've got a cure.
True. Yeah, well, that is true. I think Dr. Jeremy Nell, if I recall reading something, who was the principal investigator of what they call the Solidarity trial in South Africa, in fact confirmed, I think, was it last month or a few weeks back, because there's just so much of information out there, that they were going to go ahead with the hydroxychloroquine arm of the trial. And as I understand it, I'm not so sure, but subject to correction, the trial is apparently being conducted in about 10 to 14 hospitals in most of South Africa's provinces. And what the talk is that apparently recruitment of patients hospitalized at COVID-19 with these healthcare facilities allegedly may possibly begin soon. Nell is he's the head of the infectious disease division at the University of Witwatersrand, and apparently mentions that this drug may be used. But I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned Tedros. You mentioned the World Health Organization. I don't know if you've discussed this before on your platform, but the World Health Organization is run by an individual called Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, who was notorious on 3 occasions for covering up a cholera pandemic in Ethiopia. I don't know if your viewers know about that. You just simply type in Tedros Adhanom prior to his appointment in the World Health Organization.
Right.
You look at the background of this particular man. There was a cholera epidemic that was happening in Ethiopia, and he concealed it and covered it up, and in fact lied when there were ministerial reports leading to the deaths of thousands of people. And then he found himself appointed in the position that he is, with certainly no medical background. He's not a doctor.
Well, it sounds like the ANC to me.
Position.
Maybe the ANC are behind the World Health Organization. That's how they appoint people. It's absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's a reality that we need to be aware of it. Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, just addressing the side chat again, guys, if you've got questions, please just put them into the side chat, and I will put those to Yusuf a bit later. Now, I want to change track a little bit here, because, I mean, I'm just hutful about this whole vaccine thing, okay, because I think it's a complete and utter scam. And talking about scams, do you think Ramaphosa is a man of integrity? And what is his role in this fiasco of the lockdown? Let's get back to South African politics.
Wow. Well, I mean, you want specifics about the man, or in relation to the lockdown itself? I mean, in relation to the lockdown.
Well,
I mean,
both.
He's clearly been compromised. But I mean, I think we need to know the background of Cyril. You know, you mentioned about individuals that have a low IQ. I'll tell you something about Cyril. The man's got no low IQ. The man knew where he was going, and certainly comes from a background of subterfuge and manipulation.
Yes.
If you look, for example, in the 80s, when the trade union movement was so strong and in a sense powerful in terms of railing against mining houses like Anglo American and other mining companies in a general sense. Ramaphosa was a lawyer, an astute lawyer, by the way, and he was the head of the mining company. He was the head of the trade union movement, and he was extremely active in, for example, challenging the abuse that was taking place by some of these international mining companies. Mm-hmm. And what happened is that during the administration of P.W. Botha, what essentially happened, or what transformed, is that well ahead of the ANC a decade later, you had the creation of a certain rich black class that would play a role in which the writer Frantz Fanon pointed out, a kind of a transmission line between the nation and a capitalism rampant though camouflaged. And what happened is that you had a situation of a man that so was hell-bent against Anglo-American, and post-1994, who becomes the front man for Anglo-American?
Yeah.
Cyril Ramaphosa.
Yeah, Marikana.
I think this basic, he's obviously his role in Marikana, but the point which people don't seem to understand is that, and I think this is crucial, that people need to obviously be aware of this, is that there was a significant co-option that essentially took place, which people don't know. If people talk about what happened at Codesa. People talk, for example, of what happened in 1994 and what the ANC has done. But if you look at the period specifically, and a lot of writers have written about this in detail. One individual is a chap called Sampi Terreblanche, I don't know if you heard of him, Lost in Transformation. What they point out is that in 1987 and 1990, you had a situation where, for example, ANC officials, led by people like Thabo Mbeki and so on and so forth, they met and they were having repeated clandestine meetings with members of the Afrikaner elite.
Yeah.
And the Broederbond, by the way.
Broederbond, yeah.
The ANC meeting with the Broederbond in England and in different parts of the world. You had, for example, someone like Moff Terreblanche. He made the point, which was something along the line that if you drink with somebody and have another drink, it brings an understanding. And really, we became friends. And so secret were those convivial meetings that none but a select few in the ANC knew about them. And people to this day, shockingly enough, don't know about them. And the prime movers were those who essentially profited from apartheid. You had the British mining giant Consolidated Goldfields, which picked up the tab. Absolutely. And at the same time, Nelson Mandela, unfortunately, he was conducting his own sections at Paul's Moor prison. I mean, he was in contact with Neil Barnard, who headed the National Intelligence Services, and so on and so forth. And what essentially happened, what basically happened is that you know, when you look at some of the magazines, I was too small in the 80s. I was still growing up. If you look at the magazines like Ebony, Tribute, Enterprise, Drum Magazine, they all celebrated the aspirations of a black bourgeoisie, whose, you know, you had a situation where their garage Soweto homes were included on tours for foreigners and so on. And what the PW Botha regime did is that it even offered black businessmen generous loans from the Industrial Development Corporation, the IDC, and that allowed them to set up companies outside the Bandistan. And in that way, you have, for example, black companies like New Africa Investments, which is part of Cyril Ramaphosa. He's the head, could buy part of Metropolitan Life. And so within a decade, you had a situation that Ramaphosa was deputy chairman of what effectively was a creation of apartheid, and today is one of the richest men in the world, and if not, I think, fourth or fifth richest person in South Africa. And so the point is that when people talk about the transformation, what actually happened? What actually happened was a situation where the ANC, in the broad sense, was co-opted. And essentially, you had a far more pernicious form of apartheid continuing under the ANC. I mean, there were two forms of apartheid. There was the apartheid, of course, color. You can't sit on this bench. You can't go there. That was the peripheral apartheid. But the more pernicious apartheid was economic apartheid.
Right.
And with the advent of the ANC, you have a situation of economic apartheid on steroids, where the black have got, where you've never had a chasm between the ultra-rich and the super poor in a society over the past 24 years as you had today. And that's why you had a situation where, as many people pointed out, they had to get rid of Chris Hani, because Chris Hani was basically a thorn in the side of many people within the ANC against people like Joe Modise. And you look at the murder of Chris Hani. I don't know, you know, there was a book I was reading some time back which documented how you know, people like Clive Derby Lewis and all these extremists were just simply the front men. But in reality, the ANC has a lot to answer in relation to that. So what the reality is that economic apartheid in South Africa today, we are living under economic apartheid. And that has basically replaced legal apartheid with the same consequences for the same people.
Exactly.
Yet it is greeted as it's greeted as one of the greatest achievements in world history, which is a shame. I mean, if you look at the TRC Commission, the so-called institutional hearings that were held were an absolute sham. You had the South African Chamber of Mines, their century of exploitation was summed up in something like 6 derisory pages. There was no apology for, you know, the swathes of land that was turned into a modern-day Chernobyl. There was no pledge of compensation for countless men and women that, you know, died of occupational diseases. Many could not afford an oxygen tank. Many families could not afford a funeral. So what we have is a situation is that the ANC has just simply continued with that apartheid. They were co-opted.
Yeah.
And liberation governments, in a general sense, Scott, can point to real and enduring achievements. But the most basic freedom for any person, for that particular matter, is the freedom to survive, and the freedom to survive decently. And that freedom to survive decently has been withheld from the majority of South Africans. I travel to Ikopo on a daily basis. I go through the St. Faith's area. I'm not so sure if you're familiar with it. In the St. Faith's area, you see children.
Oh, yes, I know the St. Faith's area.
Defecating in the street. You see schools that have still got latrines.
Yeah.
I mean, this was what Thabo Mbeki spoke about in 2008. He wanted to get rid of this. How does it make sense that in 2020, you have children drowning in latrines?
Yeah.
I mean, what does it basically say? It's a sham. It's awful. And I think this has been withheld from the majority of South Africans, who are aware that, had the ANC in fact invested in society, invested in invested in informal economy, it could have in fact actually transformed the lives of millions. I mean, under the lockdown, who suffers? Who suffers the most? Not the big businesses. The big businesses are all open. The multinationals, the corporates, those on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. They're still there. It's the average man in the street that is basically dying and suffering, and the Joe Blogs that's basically struggling to make ends meet at the end of the day.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you raised St. Faith's, which is quite close to Ikopo. It's sort of like about 20 kilometers from Ikopo, and on that road from Ikopo through St. Faith's going down to Port Shepstone, the story behind St. Faith's is originally it was a trading post. They had a trading store there. And the fellow who had that store actually brought out token coins. This is back in the early 1900s. And when he left his trading store, he actually set up this magnificent mansion just outside Port Shepstone on the banks of the Umzimkhulu River. And I went there in 2011. And I just can't think of his name right now, but fabulous place, very, very historic. But let's get back.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. Let's get back to really the current state of affairs in South Africa. Okay, we know about the National Democratic Revolution, or the NDR. That's the basically the document of the South African Communist Party. Now, are we headed for a communist state, and is this a legitimate thing that they're doing to push us that way?
My answer to that is, those that basically raise that, and I've seen people on the far right that speak about the communist threat. There is no communist threat. What you are dealing with is hardcore corporate fascism to the extreme. I mean, during the apartheid era, the Nats, the National Party, they were not strong enough to maintain the so-called oppression of the black majority through the use of force alone. And what happened is that to remedy that problem, the Nats employed a far more dangerous weapon, and that was a weapon of ideas. And the strongest of that was fear. And so the backbone of apartheid repression was the so-called Rooi Gevaar, or in certain instances they call it the Swart Gevaar.
Yeah.
And those terms, my wife is Afrikaner, but basically they would say that in Afrikaans the term for would mean red danger, black danger. It essentially created an irrational and unjustifiable fear of communists and black violence. I mean, the expression were wrapped in Afrikaans because the Nats were Afrikaans, but they were, in a general sense, the embodiment back then of anti-black hatred and authoritarianism. And, what I find quite bizarre is that you've got people like Simon Roach, who I interestingly interviewed, I think sometime last year, that still play and throw out this canard of this red threat or the communist threat. There is no communist threat on South Africa. If anything at all, there is a hardcore corporate fascistic threat against South Africans. I mean, this whole idea of the commies, it's something which, it's actually a relic of the coal age. For example, if you look at the United States in the 1950s, against the commies, when they had both, the Senator Joseph McCarthy and the the former scam U.S. presidential, the U.S. President Richard Nixon.
Right.
They started a veritable witch hunt for communists in the country and warned of the ever looming, threat of global communism. And similarly, it happened in Russia during the time of Joseph Stalin. I don't think we're going to have a communism in the ideological sense that you saw in Stalinist Russia, for that particular matter, or that was there in the Cold War. That communism is dead. That's never going to happen. It's not going to come back again. I mean, even if you look at China now, the modern day China, it's described as communist in many respects. I seem to be getting an echo. It's described as communist in many instances, but in actual fact, it's corporate fascism. And I think those people who are raising this issue of the communist threat are actually setting up a false, what could I say, a false dichotomy, or a straw man to what could ordinarily have been a legitimate critique. I mean, the idea of creating the whole notion of a communist threat is simply to create the idea or create the notion of fear, which is what groups like Landers, for example, and to a certain extent, AfriForum, and this group particularly that, help me out, that's in the Eastern Cape, Western Cape, they've Orania, that there's going to be a communist threat. This is basically a fear, a paranoid fear that's being imposed to say that, look, we're going to now have the hordes take over us. The reality, in fact, is that the ANC is not in it for the battle of ideas. Ideologically, most of them have never read Das Kapital. I mean, I've got Das Kapital with me, Karl Marx. I've got The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. No one, I have my doubts that people have actually gone through Das Kapital, or you've got individuals that have got this ideological know-how of socialism or anything along that particular line. I think the greater danger is that the ANC, in a broad sense, is engaged in war against society in general, not against certain race groups. I mean, obviously, they may throw out the card of race, and when they throw out black economic empowerment, or BEE,
that's just a red herring.
That's a red herring for certain individuals, for example, gaining wealth and acquiring wealth in the shortest possible time. Yeah. Similarly to the issue of land reformation. I mean, certainly land reformation, I believe in egalitarianism, should happen, but you cannot trust the ANC with land reformation, because land reformation for them, as with the EFF, simply means that the cadres and certain selected individuals get a certain amount of land. The ANC and the government in general is not concerned. Is not concerned about people, or black people, white people, in general sense.
Yeah, I just want to raise a point here, Yusuf, and that is, we've been talking for the last 5 to 10 minutes about how the economy is controlled, basically. Now, what I have on my channel is a term called black privilege. Now, you mentioned that there's this upper class amongst the black elite who seem to get all the tenders, they seem to be making all the money, and the rest of the African population is worse off than they were pre-1994. So you got this huge divide between this elite class, which again I call black privilege, and then the rest of the community. And we're also talking about the fascist financial threat, you know, the way these big organizations work. And I find it very, very misleading. It's a misnomer when you got people like Julius Malema and even Ramaphosa himself talking about white monopoly capitalism, because there are probably only two people in South Africa, or two families in South Africa, that you could really suggest represent white monopoly capitalism, and that is obviously the Ruperts and the Oppenheimer family. But the rest of the the rest of the white population have been brought down to a point where, apart from a few exceptions, they are living just above the poverty line. And for these politicians to go around suggesting that there's a huge amount of white monopoly capitalism happening, to me is a completely misleading statement, because so many people have now been brought into poverty to the point where many are living in squatter camps. There's a huge white population today living in squatter camps. And this brings me to the lockdown. What Ramaphosa said back in April this year, he said, the economy is going fantastically well under lockdown. And then he brought out the explanation. He said, because when we come out the other side, we're going to be set for black economic transformation. And what I read behind that was what he was talking about was that all these small white businesses would go bankrupt, leaving a huge hole for him and his cadres to go and set up businesses to take up the slack. What are your thoughts about that?
But the point is, again, I don't see things in black and white. For example, you mentioned, I was extremely angry, and I maybe just bring this up when I saw a documentary by this far right girl, if I may call it. I know her mentor, Stefan Molyneux, but there was a girl called Lauren Southern. I don't know if you heard.
Oh yes, Lauren Southern, yeah.
And she came up with a documentary that. I
don't know what farmlands.
The farmlands, yeah, the farmlands documentary, and what I found extremely offensive about that documentary was this: is that she went to, for example, the poor white community that was unfortunately living in squatter camps, and she presented that in a broad sense as a kind of a new normal for white people in general. Bearing in mind that, in a broad sense, poverty, in fact, affects all classes and race groups. But still, up to this day today, up to now, 2020, South Africa is an emerging and fragile economy, approximately 10 million taxpayers, 60 million people. The reality is that the vast majority of poor people in this country happen to be black people. I mean, whites,
they make up 90% of the population.
Well, I mean, yeah, 90% of the population. But even if you, for example, look at it on a proportionate basis, I mean, there's if you look, for example, at a phenomenon that I recall growing up, which the ANC has just simply continued. But I was kind of growing up in the 80s during the kind of end of apartheid. In Durban, we had something during apartheid, by the way, of poor whites and what they would call the white hobos. If you recall them, the white hobos they would have suits. I mean, these were hobos in the sense of the traditional understanding of hobos that you read, where they would wear suits, they'd be walking around with mattresses. And that was a situation that was there during the apartheid regime, where, for example, you had a rich class of whites, you had a middle class, and of course you had a small inkling of poor white people. And then, of course, you had other race groups. And what the ANC simply did was that they continued the trajectory in terms of now having a situation where you've got a rich black elite, you've got now a middle-class black group, which never existed, and, of course, you've got blacks that are more poorer now than they ever were during the heights of apartheid. Now, there may certainly be other groups and other race groups that are in poverty. But in a broad sense, I think, there is also at the same time, and I think the white community, there is at the same time a kind of a paranoia amongst the white community that there is an attack leveled just simply against them. I think all our race groups, be us white, be us Indian, black, colored, whatever the case, should come together collectively and see the ANC and government for what it is, which is a rapacious entity that is almost on the verge of collapse and has to stay in position at all costs to, for example, maintain its stranglehold over society in general. I mean, they would dump the next man on the street and their mothers, for that particular matter, just simply to stay in power. And I mean, if you look, for example, since 1994, the number of people living, this was written in 2006, Naomi Klein, The Shock Doctrine. She's written a book called The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, and she gives a list where she says, for example, between 1991 and 2006, the unemployment rate for black South Africans more than doubled from 23% to 48%, higher than it was during apartheid. Of South Africa's 35 million black citizens, only 5,000 earned more than 60,000, according to her, dollars per year. The number of whites in that income bracket is 20 times higher, and many earn far more than that amount. The ANC has built 1.8 million homes, but in the meantime, 2 million people have lost their homes. Now, the reality is that as much as the situation is bad for a lot of us in South Africa, blacks are still on the receiving end, and the poorest of the poor in the townships, whether it's a white township,
Yusuf,
happen to be black people. Yeah.
I totally agree with you that a large percentage of blacks are on the receiving end. I've actually made that point. There's no question about that. But there is a huge issue when you've got an ANC government that have brought over 100 laws that are race-based, and they target a minority group, and in particular the white community. I'm talking about things like black economic empowerment and triple B, double E, and all they are, if you look at what these policies are, is they're actually a transfer of wealth from the white community to the well-connected ANC cadres, those who get black privilege. That's what's actually going on with these laws. Now, the people who are suffering as a result of these racist laws are the white community, the Indian community, the colored community, and the black community. Because the only people who are benefiting are those people at the top.
It's not black economic empowerment. I mean, you're talking about empowering people from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. That's not happening. It's a charade and a fake, a red herring, basically to create the illusion, and it's an illusory perception that, for example, we are there to empower the poor, those who are historically disadvantaged. It's a and it's a devious, illusory, legislative, so-called particular trajectory that has been imposed upon South African society to create the perception, those who don't see it, that they're empowering black people. But it's not, as you correctly pointed out. And I may add also this, that according to all economists right now, I mean, lockdown is costing approximately 10 billion rands a day. More than 10 billion rands a day.
Huge cost.
Huge amount. But what was also amazing, which people don't know, is that, in level 5, the first 2 weeks of the lockdown,
right,
the South African government flouted its own lockdown regulation rules by selling plane loads of military equipment to Turkey. And that was confirmed by the Turkish ambassador, Elif Ulgan, who basically stated that the cargo was essentially military ammunition that was bought from Rheinmetall Denel munition. I mean, this is outrageous. When people could not go on the streets, could not walk down the road, or could not sell just simply sweets as individual hawkers, you were dealing with allowing a plane load of military equipment to Turkey, a government that is known to engage in violation of human rights against its own Kurdish population. Yeah. I mean, this is insanity of the worst kind. You have, for example, the very first week, the KZN Department of Social Development, they procured 48,000 blankets to the value of 30 million rands for the homeless. I mean, the inflated prices clearly indicate that it was corrupt activity during the pandemic. You've got the scumbag Ace Magashule and his sons now with this PPE. No. I mean, it seems to me that death is a very expensive business in South Africa. Poverty is a very lucrative industry for people who want to take advantage and exploit the poor.
Yeah. I want to raise a point here, because you just raised Ace Magashule, who I call king of the gangsters. Before we go specifically to Ace and Zandile Gomeri and the developments there, what I'd like to just raise so people understand this is that a few weeks ago, South Africa, thanks to Ace Magashule, apparently he was the beneficiary, or the ANC were the beneficiary, millions of rands worth of PPE, or personal protective equipment, was put on a plane and sent to Cuba. And nobody knows why, or why they would send that sort of stuff off to Cuba. And then, just last week, America sent South Africa $6 million worth of PPE equipment. And they demanded that equipment be under their control the whole time, to the point where it actually got to a hospital, because they understood that corruption was so rampant in the ANC government. And that's just a reflection of how America's starting to view South Africa. And Lana Marx was personally involved in that. She actually said that the ANC government is corrupt at the time that they were talking about the $6 million worth of PPE equipment. But here you've got this contradiction in terms. You've got a delivery of millions of rands worth of PPE equipment and blankets going to Cuba from South Africa, and a few weeks later you got $6 million worth of donations of PPE coming to South Africa because there's a shortage in South Africa. Ace Magashule was central to that delivery to Cuba, and this man is. I mean, he makes the mafia in Italy look like amateurs. He just gets away with whatever he likes. And apparently Zandile Gomedi, who's now one of the leadership in KwaZulu-Natal in the ANC, I think they call her an MPL, despite the fact that she's facing a huge corruption trial, the reason she got the position was because she's a good friend of guess who? Ace Magashule. Now, would you like to talk about this whole issue? Because you're close to that. You're in KwaZulu-Natal. Tell us what is actually going on behind the scenes there with Gomedi and Magashule.
Well, let me start off with Ace. I mean, you know, there's a book I brought. I don't know if have you read this book? The one by Peter Louis Myberg. I'd urge your viewers to
Gangster
get it.
State.
Gangster State. Unraveling. There's an interesting chapter in this particular book, which goes just simply beyond corruption, and it's called "The Assassination of Nobi in Gombane."
Right.
The assassination, the murder of him.
Nothing would surprise me.
If we have time, we can probably go into it. I mean, there can be no doubt whatsoever in my mind that Ace Magashule, and I mean, if you see him with the sunglasses, he's the kind of the African version of Michael Corleone in The Godfather.
Right.
If you're familiar with the Godfather movies, he's become a symbol of the problems we face.
Or Al Capone.
And that's, well, Al Capone. I would say more. You could probably put Al Capone in that, or Bugsy Malone for that particular matter. But I mean, this man is a thug. I have no doubt in my mind. Yeah. This man is a thug. This man is not just simply corrupt, but this man is dangerous, and this man can kill. And I think that's the more dangerous thing, which many activists have been bumped out. And we talk about David Mabuza. If we have the time, we can go into it. But what the problem is that
he hires hitmen. David Mabuza.
No, absolutely. Well, Ace wouldn't be that's not past Ace himself.
Yeah.
But what's compounded by the fact that there is this constant refrain that he does nothing wrong, he does nothing illegal. I mean, you mentioned the PPE. His son bought a BMW X7 worth 2 million rand. I think about 2 million rands. I mean, and what the history, Magashule himself would probably, in my opinion, not engage in such forms of provocative posturing if he did not think that it is right to do, and more importantly, nothing will happen to him anyway. And I mean, on the evidence presented thus far, it's basically it won't be easy to stop or restrain him. And I think the reason for that is because he's got a lot of hold, and he knows more about those higher up than him.
Exactly.
And the fact that he has information about those higher up than him, obviously, would basically indicate. I mean, if you look at the history of the position of the Secretary General in the ANC, that's of crucial importance. When you look at the relationship between Kgalema Motlanthe, who was the Secretary General, when the relationship between him and President Thabo Mbeki broke down, Jacob Zuma ascended to power in Polokwane. The same dynamic, in fact, repeated itself with Gwede Mantashe and Zuma. When Mantashe was defending Nkandla, Zuma was safe. But when Zuma went too far and fired the Minister of Finance, Nhlanhla as the finance minister, Mantashe moved against him. And so what you basically find is that this latest manifestation of this thug's power has basically been the National Executive Committee's decision to reinstate a number of people, both linked to, for example, the VBS positions, to their positions in order to segment certain power. I mean, what were we told before Ramaphosa came to power? He says, look, he's just waiting to come to power. He can't take a drastic step against all these corrupt individuals because of the fact that this may impact on his particular ascent to the presidency. What happened after the presidency? These individuals remained there. I mean, Gwede Mantashe, for example, but I mean, I don't want to go too much into that. Let's go to Zandile Gumede, since she's basically in my region, KZN. What has happened, what your viewers who may know or who may not know, is that she served as eThekwini mayor between 2016 and 2019. I had made repeated attempts to interview her for my TV program, which I've done on. I've interviewed the now present mayor, Olisi Kaunda, prior to him becoming the mayor. But I attempted on numerous occasions to interview her. We sent out requests to her. She just simply turned it down. When she was a mayor between 2016 and 2019 of Durban, forensic investigations by the Hawks, in fact, showed a significant amount of money laundering, corruption during her tenure, and personal involvement in alleged illegal tender awards, and of course, fake employment creation. And so she was arrested in May 2019 on charges of corruption, and then was removed as from their position of city mayor by the ANC in August 2019. So currently,
but she
she's
kept
on
a councillor position.
Bail. Well, I'm going to come to that.
Okay.
She's on 50,000 rands bail for her alleged role in the Durban, what's called the Durban solid waste tender scandal, that essentially involves other councillors and service providers, where they were wholly grotesquely inflated for prices close to R500 million, 500 million rands.
Right. And
what strangely happened this week is that despite this, she's been appointed to the KwaZulu-Natal legislature. This week, she's been appointed to the KwaZulu-Natal legislature, and that's an insult to South Africans. And what she said, and I saw some of the reports this morning, is that her salary as an ordinary councillor, she was earning a gross salary of 512,000 rands per annum. As a councillors, my experience with councillors, they do nothing. But as a member of the provincial legislature, I want the folks to hear this out here. Her gross salary would be 1.1 million rands right now, as well as several perks, including 24 free flights. And this is not just simply flights on economy class. This is first class flights and various other allowances. So here you have a situation, a woman who is implicated in theft, corruption, and money laundering to the value of R500 million rands, who's out on 50,000 rands bail, who has a criminal case against her in the Commercial Crime Court in Durban, is now appointed as a KZN MPL, member of the provincial legislature, at a gross salary of 1.1 million. And what is also more concerning and disconcerting is this, which is more disturbing for me, is that the investigating officer has had death threats and has had attempts made on his life.
Yeah.
And one of the key witnesses that was going to testify against her, who was involved in the finance in the eThekwini municipality, was shot dead in cold blood outside his home.
Yeah, he was going on
Now,
run.
what does it tell you with that? I mean, and she's got involvement with the I don't know if you know these individuals, the Qaba brothers. Who are the Qaba brothers? Have you ever heard of them?
No.
These guys, I mean, are dangerous. They control the taxi industry. Mandla is the actual nephew of Jacob Zuma. They were involved in alleged political assassinations in 2000 outside the Durban High Court, and they were awarded a massive contract with the buses with the eThekwini municipality. And now, of course, they are respectable businessmen. But tell me, Scott, do you smell a rat here? If somebody is a star witness against you, and that person gets shot dead in cold blood, what does it tell you? And when there's no investigation and nobody can trace, I mean, there's something disturbing going on.
Okay,
I mean, if she was unofficially...
I want to tell you how these hitmen work, because I actually read an article where someone interviewed a hitman in South Africa. And how it works is like this, is they get given a job, and they can earn up to 400,000 rand for one hit, depending on the importance of the person who's been actually going to be taken out. And as part of the process, what they do is they watch carefully as to when and where they're going to do the hit because they look at the routine that the person has that they're targeting. And before they actually take them out, this is the critical thing. Before they take them out, they contact someone in the police service, a police officer who they bribe, and that police officer goes and parks his car close to where the crime is going to take place, because then he becomes the police officer who investigates the crime, and of course he botches the job completely, and he'll still keep his job because this is a South African police service. But the fact is that these hitmen are so organized that they actually have police on their payroll who go and park their cars close to where the hit's going to take place so that they can be the first ones there to investigate. This is how well planned these hits are.
It's a sophisticated element. I mean, and you know what? In the past, we spoke about the apartheid death squads. Today, we've got ANC death squads that are basically operating. And I mean, it's such a sophisticated enterprise. The problem that we have is that if Zandile Gumede was removed because of a criminal charges, then her lack of judgment for, at the very least, being tainted by such a scandal should be questioned. And so it's unfair that South Africans, in a general sense, should carry her financially, because the 1.1 million rands that Zandile Gumede would be paid by you and I. I mean, the project manager of Ota Tabile Zuma, she basically stated in a news report covered on News 24 that it's basically unclear what benefit Zandile Gumede will bring to the provincial legislature. I mean, considering that she was officially removed as a mayor for a poor governance performance. So her skills are wholly unsuited within a legislative setting. But it seems to me that the more corrupt you are, the more criminal you are, the more tainted you are, the higher you go up the ladder.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a disturbing thing that people need to be speaking out against. I mean, there's a concern, you know, and even OTA has called the deployment of high-ranking politicians with unresolved allegations of corruption. I mean, look at the present situation. Just right now, we've got the Zondo Commission. You spend billions of rands on a commission of inquiry. Why is the same amount of money not spent in the prosecution of these individuals? I mean, a commission of inquiry just simply makes recommendations against corrupt people. But if you've got witnesses that are there to testify against the individuals, why waste that money on a commission of inquiry when you can essentially, and by the way, what's his name? Zondo himself comes from Ikopo, by the way. So
well, there you go.
He's also from Ikopo. Good judge, may I add. Yeah, good judge, I may add. But the point is that it's a wasted effort. It's a kind of it's a red herring again. It takes your attention away. And so this is a reality of what we've got in the South African situation.
Right now, just getting back to Ace Magashula, I think he could be in a whole lot of shit, and I'll tell you why. The authorities have got off their asses at last in the Free State, and they've arrested a number of people, high up ANC cadres, regarding that scandalous dairy farm situation. And I believe that, you know, these guys sing like canaries when they're in the courts. They're trying to protect their own asses, and I can see stuff coming out about Magashula. And this could be the beginning of the unraveling of the ANC, because if Magashula's got to go before the courts, he's going to be singing like a canary too. And who knows who's going to be on the receiving end. What are your thoughts about that?
No, absolutely. I was seeing a report. I mean, this was just this. Today's the 20th. On Tuesday, you had the issue of the 5 Free State government officials that were brought. They were appeared in court on charges of corruption, fraud, money laundering. That essentially brought the investigation into the Estina Dairy Project one step closer. The Estina Dairy Project. I mean, the 5 suspects, they face collectively charges in the amount of 200 to 300 million rands. What the argument is that it was in fact, it was in fact Magashule himself, as then premier of Free State. He was the person that first authorized the Estina dairy project in 2011.
That was
And he
the
then
Guptas.
delegated authority to the then MEC, well, the Guptas, but the then MEC for Agriculture, Mosebenzi Zwane, and then she obviously linked up with the Guptas, because
Yeah.
Zwane in turn delegated the authority Tabete to enter into a 99-year lease agreement with Estina Paras, that's an Indian partner. And
Right.
that was done with no formal partnership in place, and it was based on a kind of a vague memorandum of agreement. But all this basically goes back to Magashule, because in 2012, Magashule authorized Tabete's trip to India in February 2012, where there was a meeting that took place with the Gupta, one of the Gupta associates. And essentially that Gupta associate subsequently was formally appointed the following day by Magashule as a member of the Premier's advisory panel on the Estina Dairy project. And the office of the Premier, when Magashule was in power, was then used to send invitations to various dignitaries to make official visits to the project, etc., etc. And he was also the Premier in 2014, when there was a report which recommended that payments to Estina be in fact halted immediately. And what those payments were in relation to was a so-called contract between Free State provincial government and the Estina, which was eventually obviously cancelled by Magashule officially in 2014, but the officials continued to allocate funding to the project. Now the question we need to ask is, where did that particular money go through? And therefore, I wasn't surprised, when the public protector's report, Busisiwe Mekwabane, which is quite amazing. She raised legitimate concerns about Ramaphosa, but idiotically, in the report, the public protector failed to investigate the role of senior leaders like Magashule, like the MC Mosebenzi Zwane, who were at the center of that project, the 200 to 300 million rand project that intended to support so-called emerging farmers. But there were no farmers that were supported. I mean, in fact, if you look at the report itself, the public protector's report, she ordered her staff to exclude politicians from the first report. And so her report was basically a farce, a total farce.
Yeah.
And in fact, she committed a crime, because in terms of the act, which governs the public protector, Section 34 of the act, it renders a criminal offense not to report alleged corruption by individuals in positions of oversight and authority. So, as Premier of the province, Magashule would have been burdened with that responsibility. And the situation is that he would be liable, and the public protector, having covered him up, would also be liable in terms of having covered up what basically happened. So I have absolutely no doubt that this man was behind it, and that this man received money. And I've put it on record on social media. I mean, I've called the man a thug. I've called him a criminal. If you want to sue me, go ahead and sue me.
Yeah.
And a lot of these individuals, I've called out David Mabuza as the so-called godfather of Mpumalanga during the 2010 scandal with the Mbombela Stadium, where tenders were basically going out left, right, and center. And you had people that were exposing him. State witnesses were killed off.
Now, just getting back to Ace Magashule and the dairy farm scandal, I'm led to believe that the Guptas got 30 million rand cash out of that, and they used that money to have a lavish wedding, one of their family, at Sun City. Did you hear that?
I read that particular thing in what's his name? In Peter Louis Meyerberg. He's written a book.
Yeah.
I've got the book somewhere in my library. He raised the same issue, that what had happened was, I think the bank statements show that essentially the Estina project, I think there was something like 30 to 40 million rands that were basically deposited. All of them, I mean, they were deposited. Monies were basically transferred. And they essentially went to the Guptas. And I mean, whether they use that money, I would assume that part of the funds, a lot of the funds from the Free State funds were in fact contributed to the luxury Gupta wedding. I mean, a lot of journalists have covered this. Eyewitness News, for example, the Daily Maverick, millions were milked. And essentially what had happened was that basically that would essentially mean that would mean the people of South Africa have essentially paid for the lavish Gupta wedding.
Yeah. The taxpayers.
The expenses. In fact, KPMG, I think, they were the auditors of one of the Gupta companies. I can't recall what the name of it was. And that company played a role in diverting cash that was earmarked for the dairy project to reimburse most of the wedding expenses. And I think the wedding, although they estimated as 30 million, I think it's understated. It was much, much more than that. I mean, they booked out the Sun City for how many days was it? It was 5
about
or 6
a week.
days. It was a lavish affair. Plus, they had utilization of the airport, the official staff. I forget the name. The official airbase, which is just used simply for presidents and dignitaries. I mean, certainly monies must have passed through in relation to that. In fact, this is quite clear that this has happened not just with them, and I think the Guptas are one part. I think the situation goes far more deeper than just simply the Guptas. There's far more money, and we've just simply
we're just touching the surface of the corruption.
The tip of the iceberg. I mean, there's been promises to get that money back, but there's going to be no. I mean, we can go so many other issues. I mean, there's Eskom. Eskom itself. When I know Ted Blom personally, the energy analyst Ted Blom, and I mean, what he has told me sends shivers down my back.
Yeah.
I got a forum, WhatsApp group called the Open Debate Forum, which has about 200 members, and he gave me the numbers of Brian Molefe, Ashok Singh, and Machele Koko, and I instantly put them on my chat group, and we then grilled them and questioned them, and we told them that if these allegations are false, we challenge you to sue us for defamation. I mean, they were silent, more silent than church rats.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's absolutely no defense to this kind of scandal and grotesque theft that's taking place.
Do you think that De Ruyter is doing a good job at Eskom?
Well, I mean, it's too early to say. I don't know, what he's done. I mean, the situation at Eskom, there's been so much of monies. There's been billions that have been. Ted Blom told me, for example, when you look at the Gupta mining houses, there were billions paid over to the Gupta. Normally, you pay for coal, for the acquisition of coal that are then used in the turbines, the entire process. He told me that there were instances where billions were paid and nothing was received, or in certain instances, rocks and stones were received, which were destroying the turbines. I mean, how are you going to get that money back? How on earth are you going to get that money back?
Can't.
The vast majority of that money is going to lose. It has left the country. All you can do is arrest the criminals. But how are you going to arrest these individuals that have now left the country, that are now a pariah unto themselves, that now who knows where on earth they may be? They may be in probably some sort of tax haven paradise, or in Dubai, or probably elsewhere, maybe in the Maldives, whatever the case is. I mean, the reality is that it was the situation of corruption was sophisticatedly engineered in such a way that eventually, when the explosion took place, these criminals ensured that they would never get caught out. Right. Therefore, they left a few days before the collapse was going to be inevitable. A few days before Zuma stepped down, the Guptas were out of the country. They knew what was going on. But it's not just the Guptas. There's many other parties. There's many other entities, far more, in my opinion, dangerous than them, that are operating the scenes behind what we see.
Now, this brings me to a subject we haven't touched on yet, and we're both involved in putting out our views in alternative media. When you look at the mainstream media in South Africa, I think the job that they're doing is a complete and utter disgrace. We had that situation in the Boomspruit just a couple of days ago, where those three murderers were being brought before the courts because they were trying to get bail, and the whole community was outraged, and over 1,000 people joined in like a car parade, and they just, very peaceful, very well organized.
Yeah.
We actually covered it for over 3 hours on this channel live, and that wasn't touched by the media in South Africa. It was a huge protest, but you get someone burning a tire on a road, and that's news. Whereas here you've got this huge protest. It's largely the white community. I understand that, but it was completely ignored. I find that quite incredible, and that brings me to this new internet censorship bill that the ANC government are bringing in, where before you produce a video in South Africa, you've got to get it classified. You've got to pay money. You've got to be a member of this Film and Publication Board organization so that you can actually put a video up on YouTube. What are your views on all that? Do you think this is just blatant censorship?
Well, I mean, there's a growing censorship that is happening not just in South Africa, but globally. And I think this is part and parcel of the pattern that we see around us, where there's so much of information out there, and people obviously today have an access to an alternative form of communication that, growing up, you'd probably get up in the morning and see TV1, TV2, and TV3 back then in the day. Now you've got a situation where there's not just simply 24-hour news channels, 24-hour cartoons, but I mean, on the alternative media, you've got a whole host of information on the internet, the World Wide Web. I'm not saying that the World Wide Web is positive. There's a lot of negativity, but there's so much of information out there that the traditional purveyors of information cannot control the level of discourse that is basically going on. I mean, think about this. Let's assume you had a global lockdown in the year 1985. I mean, would we have seen a situation that we see here today in 2020 with the kind of level of awareness in terms of what's going on? No, the vast majority of us would not have probably known what's going on.
Yeah.
But with the reality of worldwide media, alternative information, people just getting access to information on the fingertips. I don't need to now stay up and sit and watch the 8 o'clock news as I did as a child. I mean, I can watch the news at 1 o'clock in the morning. I can watch the news while sitting in my bed. Whilst driving a car, I can watch the news on my phone. I can basically look at alternative websites. With all that happening, I believe that power in all its forms and manifestations of power are being concerned. And so there's an attempt to censor what can be viewed as acceptable and what cannot be viewed as acceptable. Regarding this bill, I mean, I haven't read, by the way, I should have, but I haven't read the entire bill, and I've seen talk about it in the mainstream media. I don't think, in my opinion, that it could and should be able to pass constitutional muster. Now, I may be wrong, because I remember in 2004, when I was serving articles as a fresh and up-and-coming attorney, there was a body of legislation called the Anti-Terrorism Bill legislation, the protection of constitutional democracy against terrorist and related activities. But the fascistic nature of that bill was that people were allowed to be detained in excess of 24 hours, up to 30 days per time, and eventually it was passed. But I believe that I don't think you can control information. I mean, maybe to set up a media station or a media outlet, you may possibly be able to create certain rules and regulations, but how do you control communication via WhatsApp? How do you control, for example, channels on YouTube? I mean, these are obviously public utilities, but they're international at the same time.
Yeah.
Unless, of course, the holders like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, whatever that case, or other alternative platforms, I don't think it's practical in the long term. How would you shut down information? I mean, all you can do possibly is that You can shut down information through official channels. That's a possibility, and that is happening. I mean, and there's nothing much to rave about if you look at mainstream media today in South Africa, mainstream news. But I don't think you can shut down alternative information unless, of course, that you have that these very outlets, which is the internet, for example, and some of these global conglomerates, in fact, shut down the avenue and the ambit in terms of which we're operating. For example, YouTube. This is being live streamed on YouTube. This is controlled by a woman called Susan Wojcicki, I mean, who's heavily compromised, certainly has a political agenda. I mean, Facebook with Mark Zuckerberg, I mean, we know the history and the background there. They can certainly shut it down. I don't think you need a legislation to do that. And so I think this legislation that he's speaking about, censorship, is impractical. It will be a violation of the constitutional right of freedom of expression. And I think you cannot justify such a limitation. People need to be aware of their rights. I mean, the right to human dignity, the right to life, the right to freedom of religion, the right to freedom of expression, which is expressly or was criminalized under Regulation 11.5 of the Disaster Management Act, where, generally speaking, in these past few months, challenging the constitutional view of the virus or even denying the existence of the virus could theoretically be criminalized in terms of the draconian regulations. But how do you implement it? You can't implement that. I mean, so I don't know. There's been thousands of people that have been arrested under the lockdown regulations. I don't know how do you implement it unless, of course, you have people that monitor individuals. So it's impossible to generally, on the one hand, overstate how dangerous it is to allow government, our government, and governments in general, to determine what may be said and what may not be in any context.
Yeah,
but
that kills freedom of speech.
I'm optimistic. Yeah, I'm optimistic enough, Scott, to say that practically it would be difficult to implement unless you have a situation that there is a police. I mean, there's just too many of us. There's 60 million of us globally. How do you police such a huge population? What you can have a situation is where people start policing each other for and on behalf of the state or for and on behalf of government.
That sounds like Russia.
That can be basically that can become a problem.
Sounds like the USSR.
Well, certainly, yeah.
Now, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to address the side chat quickly. If you're new to this channel, please remember to subscribe to be kept informed. We have live streams most nights like this. They're always very interesting, and we have great speakers like Yusuf on. I hope you've found the discussion informative. Now, I've got a couple of questions. If people have got questions, please post them now, because we will be shutting down this live stream, I'd say, in the next half hour. But there's something you wanted me to raise tonight in your Skype to me, Yusuf, and I don't think we've touched on it yet. So let me touch on it now so you can actually address that. Okay, and what we're talking about is what really happened in 1991 to 1994, and was there a clandestine takeover, and who is really in control in South Africa? Over to you.
Yeah, I think we in a sense we focused on it a bit. You know what happened? You need to look at that on the 11th of February in 1990. When Nelson Mandela stepped out onto the Cape Town Hall, and he had the miners' leader, Cyril Ramaphosa, next to him. It was like kind of a prophetic situation in terms of what you see. He spoke to the people, and you know, that was a moment, at least from a historic point of view, even for a split second, that was a rare, it was a powerful moment where you have a situation that, in a sense, moral power, the power of justice, could triumph over anything, any kind of orthodoxy. And I think Mandela basically made the point. He was angry. Obviously, he was in jail, but he spoke about the fact that now is a time to intensify the struggle. Obviously, up to this day, nobody knows what he actually meant.
Right.
And then the next day, there appeared to be a retreat, and the retreat quickened. For example, I mean, you had a situation where mines. There was going to be no public ownership of the mines. Mines were certainly going to continue on the same trajectory of private ownership, where you had these private corporate cartels controlling the mines and the wealth leaving the country. There's no actual wealth reaching the people where they could share in the wealth, develop education, homes, and so on and so forth. And then you had a situation where, banks, rapacious monopoly industries, the so-called change or modification or true change for that particular matter would be viewed as inconceivable. He seemed to be, quite strangely enough, promoting the idea, and that was a time when Margaret Thatcher, I think John Major had just come into power, but he made the telling point, I think it was him or Trevor Manuel subsequently, where they basically seemed to be presenting ideas of Thatcherite policies, in a manner of speaking. He was constantly placating and reassuring foreign business allies, the establishment, the business establishment, the very orthodoxy and cronism that had built and reinforced fascism. That became the political agenda of the New South Africa. And we need to look at the background about this, that secret deals facilitated this. If you look at 1985, and this is documented by all historians today now,
Right.
Apartheid suffered two disasters. One was that the Johannesburg stock market in 1985 crashed, and the regime defaulted on its mounting foreign debt. There was a large amount of foreign debt. And then in September of that year, you had a group which was led by Gavin Relly, who was then the chairman of the Anglo-American Corporation. He, interestingly enough, met Oliver Tambo and other liberation officials in Zambia. And from what I understand, what people have written about this is that Relly's message was that a transition, and this is in 85 with Oliver Tambo, they're talking about the struggle and people fighting for rights and freedom and so on, but there's something going on behind the scenes. And apparently Relly told, the message from Relly was that a transition from apartheid to a black governed electoral democracy was possible only if order and stability were guaranteed. Now, obviously, order and stability, everybody wants order and stability. But in a broad sense, what in actual fact that was a liberal code for a neo-fascist capitalist state in which social and economic democracy would never be a priority. For
Right.
example, if you look at it later, the aim was to split the ANC between the so-called moderates they could do business with. Who were the moderates? The moderates were Oliver Tambo, Nelson Mandela to a certain extent, Thabo Mbeki, and the majority were those on the streets who made up the United Democratic Front. And in 1987, between 1987 and 1990, you had a situation then following these particular meetings in Zambia, where ANC officials led by Mbeki, they met up with these elite in Bath, in England, and essentially the nature of the convivial meetings was that those who had profited from apartheid, for example, the British profited, the British consolidated mining giant, consolidated goldfields, they picked up the tab. They would basically ensure, they would still benefit, they would continue. The economic system behind the so-called facade of democracy would still remain the same. And what happened in Codesa was essentially just simply more public manifestation of that whole thing. It was a kind of a, most of the real victims, I mean, were denied justice. They were denied restitution. They were denied totally. All the so-called verkramtes that we talk about, they were basically escaped justice. And the irony is that, people actually blame the ANC and blame F.W. de Klerk, but it was actually P.W. Botha who laid the basis, he laid the foundation in terms of creating a rich black class that would basically play the role of a so-called transmission line between the nation and a capitalism rampant through camouflage. So in other words, what you have a situation is, for example, if you can create a new black elite, then the charade being promoted, the farce being promoted, well, now look, you've got black people in power, you've got rich black people out there, there's been a transition that has taken place, there's been a real transition that has happened. And that created a buffer and created a new class that was essentially happening. And as I mentioned earlier on, when the IDC, for example, allowed black businessmen to set up companies outside the Bantustans, that in fact allowed people like Cyril Ramaphosa, our present president, to set up the New Africa Investments. I mean, who becomes a billionaire in 5 years? Nobody. Nobody becomes a billionaire in 5 years unless, of course, you are an inventor. You are, I don't know, one of these guys. You become like Bill Gates, or well, Bill Gates. It's a bad word to use now, but I mean, unless you're someone, you don't just simply become a billionaire overnight without any seemingly contribution to society. And so what essentially happened is that there were ANC pilgrimages to the World Bank, to the IMF, and there were presentations at Davos, at G8. And so the assumption, the promise being given is that, there was a comic writer called Larry David. There was a kind of a babbling brook of bullshit that was being put forth and essentially engulfed the ANC government, especially its finance ministries. I mean, what did Trevor Manuel state? He stated, we are seeking to develop an economy in which the winners will reign supreme. Who are these winners? Who are these winners? So putting aside for a moment the so-called this well-documented self-enrichment of ANC notables, the arms deals, the theft that is happening in the past decade, the real actual crime, which people don't talk about, which is actually the taboo in society, but which serious journalists and serious historians talk about, is the fact that what actually happened in 1994 was essentially the Great Betrayal. There you had a situation. Apartheid was not just simply just the so-called, you go to a black place and someone goes to a white place. The actual underpinning of apartheid was in its economy. In its economy, the economic apartheid basically continued to this day on steroids. And essentially, what you have as a situation is that you had a potential. Millions of houses could have been built. Better health and education would have been possible. There could have been, for example, a small-scale credit system. They could have opened the way for affordable goods in the service of the majority. None of this would have required the importation of raw materials. And not only that, Scott, what about servicing the apartheid debt? I mean, the new government continued, and they said they were happy to take over. They serviced the apartheid debt of 30 billion rands on an annual basis. And to my knowledge, as I understand, they're still servicing it to this day. And I mean, Nelson Mandela himself stated that the debt burden was the single greatest obstacle to keeping the promises of the Freedom Charter. Why couldn't they just simply do that? Why couldn't they do away with it? I mean, besides the theft that is happening, the 30 billion rands that is being paid, the so-called apartheid debt, which the ANC took over, that could have been used to build houses. That could have been used to make children go to the best schools. Unemployment could have been addressed. So what we are living under today is not communism, is not a movement towards a communist state. It is a continuation of economic apartheid on steroids as never before seen. And I think that's essentially the reality of what people need to be aware of when looking at history and when looking at the actual transition process that happened. The people who suffered under apartheid were cheated. The elite that were created were just simply co-opted elite that created the facade and the charade that there's indeed transformation, but in reality there was no transformation.
Right. I want to just go back to your comment about Trevor Manuel, because he's now chairing the Rothschilds operation here in Johannesburg, which is quite ironic, another point I just want to raise is that De Beers, back in the 1980s, were allowed to move their finances out of South Africa to Switzerland. Basically, they moved everything out of South Africa to Switzerland, which immediately resulted in the rand plummeting at that time. Now, what I find very disturbing here is, and you've raised this about economic fascism, is that a company like De Beers could basically kill the economy of South Africa by moving all their money out of the country, whereas when I left South Africa in 1987, I was only allowed to take out 15,000 rand. That's 15,000 rand as a family. That was it. That's all I could take out in cash. Everything else had to be stuck behind. You look at the lack of balance in what was going on, and this is pre-1994.
Well, I mean, the mining companies and the mining houses have always been given free reign. I mean, you speak about the link with the Rothschilds. He served Trevor Manuel, in fact, served under three South African presidents. There's a good book I read about him, which was a powerful critique. I'm not so sure. Maybe you should have someone on your show, Professor Patrick Bond, who's written a book called Elite Transition and
Right.
Talk Left, Walk Right. Where essentially, I mean, Trevor Manuel was one of the key architects post 1994 that essentially facilitated what basically happened under transition, in terms of ensuring that the wealth remained with the elite, ensuring that the wealth, the mining houses took the wealth, De Beers, that the mining houses, that their power was in fact cemented to the extreme that they were not challenged in any capacity whatsoever. And I mean, not surprisingly today, all the mining houses in South Africa, I don't know, we have these so-called gimmicks on Google, and I think on Gumtree, where people are talking about sale of coal and people are wanting to buy gold and diamonds and so on. Do you know none of the mining houses in South Africa, none of them, not one, has a single sales office in South Africa? All are overseas. Not
Yeah.
one has a say. I was surprised to know this. I realized this in 2011, 2012. I was surprised. None of them are based in South Africa. I mean, this basically tells you that you've got a situation where wealth belongs to all of us, whether you black, white, colored, it's all of us. I mean, we're living now in the South African dynamic with multiple races. It's our wealth. The remnants of that wealth should be flowing down to people, to society in general, to help all. But that wealth is not ours. I mean, the gold, the diamonds do not belong to us. It belongs to foreign capitalists. It belongs to these sharks. It belongs to these individual families. And Trevor Manuel himself was complicit in allowing that to simply continue.
Right.
I mean, he, as you pointed out, he's now serving Rothschild as an advisor, deputy chairman. I think that was as early as 2014. I don't know if is he still the deputy chairman of Rothschild in South Africa?
I think so.
I think, as I understand,
That's the last I
think
heard.
he may still be. He was a senior advisor, and I think his wife is what's her name? Ramos, right? The former CEO of Absa Bank.
Yeah.
That was quite a sinister partnership that happened. I don't know if you call it a marriage
Bet.
of convenience that essentially took place. But this man is not someone, and the problem is that what has unfortunately happened, Scott, is that him, together with a number of others in the post-94 government, have developed a particular degree of respectability. And the reason why that respectability has basically grown so much over the years is because of the fact that of what happened over the past 10 years under the Zuma regime. So you had a case of these criminals here within the Zuma regime, the Zuma administration, that were so blatant and brazen in their criminality and their thuggery. But I mean, they were the kind of common robbers. But in 1994, you've got individuals that had these sophisticated machinations of criminality in a far more sophisticated fashion that people were not able to see. And so therefore they have maintained that level of respectability that would otherwise should have been ordinarily exposed, but it couldn't have been exposed because of the criminality that happened under the Zuma administration. So whilst Thabo Mbeki was written out of history by the ANC, and there was so much of move to get rid of him in 2008 in Polokwane, and what happened, he was the bad guy, the bad apple, the rotten egg of the ANC. I mean, after 10 years of the Zuma disaster, you've got groups like the EFF, Julius Malema, applauding Thabo Mbeki when he spoke, when he entered parliament. I mean, this is a scam. This is a scam that happened. I mean, that people don't see. Why is a man, and I mean, speaking of of Trevor Manuel, why is this man who steered 3 South African presidents, Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, and to a certain extent Motlanthe, through this kind of the rapids of the so-called financial whitewater rafting experience, why is he not brought to book? And one of the things of this is that people like Nelson Mandela were not economically aware. I mean, when he spoke to the people, he didn't know what a microphone was because of the years that he spent in Robben Island. He didn't know, and so what they did is that people who are in jail, and you suddenly have power, it's easy to manipulate them. I'm not saying that he was manipulated through him being devious, but manipulated through being gullible. Through making this level of compromise, so they believe that look, these people know the economy. These vulture capitalists know the economy. We should not get rid of them. We should incorporate them, not realizing that essentially in doing so, you are basically signing the funeral for the rest of South African society. And so when you have a situation where wealth is exchanged, I wouldn't say there was, Mandela's estate was not significant, but I mean, when there's wealth exchanged through a whole host of individuals around you, it becomes far more easier to control. There's an interesting documentary that I want your viewers to watch on YouTube. Maybe they could watch it. It's by a remarkable journalist called John Pilger. I believe he's Australian. I don't know if you heard of John Pilger.
Yes, I have.
Phenomenal journalist. He's got a documentary, I think, I don't know if he's back in Australia, called Apartheid Did Not Die. Where he exposes the scam totally. It was produced in 1997, but still relevant today, 23 years later, where he in fact actually shows what really happened. And I think a lot of people out there like him are speaking out about what is basically going on, and of course that the future doesn't bode well. But we need to be the eternal optimists. That's why I'm saying we have to have hope, and we have to stand together, and we need to go beyond these so-called artificial barriers of creed, color, race, them and us, because power wants to control all.
Yeah, Yusuf, I just want to pick up on a comment that Azanian Lion made, and he said Rothschild financed De Beers, and that's exactly what happened back in the 1800s. In fact, if you go to the Big Hole of Kimberley, go and walk through their museum, you will see a copy of the actual check that was written in favor of De Beers by the Rothschilds, and that was the money that they used to actually buy out all these little lots which made up the Big Hole and basically bring it under one organization, which was De Beers. And that's how Rothschild first got its claws into South Africa, and it has never let go since. It's interesting.
Well, I mean that's common. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean that shouldn't be a secret, because it was formed in the 1800s by Cecil Rhodes. Yeah. And Cecil Rhodes was financed by N.M. Rothschilds and Sons Bank. Ernst Oppenheimer, for example, when he came from Germany to Britain, and he then founded Anglo-American with the American financier J.P. Morgan. He was then elected to De Beers. So, I mean, clearly there is, I tend to kind of stay away from the ultra-right and ultra-left conspiracy theories of Rothschilds controlling the world, because I believe that the situation is far more complex and complicated than that. But certainly the Rothschilds family and the Rothschilds banking industry had a significant role in terms of funding De Beers. And I mean, De Beers today controls 80 to 85% of rough diamond distribution in South Africa. And it's been accused, was back then and still now, accused of being a monopoly. I mean, the problem we have today is De Beers, where's the headquarters of De Beers? It's in London.
It's in Switzerland, isn't it?
I thought it's in London. As I understand the headquarters, presently it's in London, not Switzerland. Maybe you've changed. The head of De Beers, the present chairman of De Beers, is actually an Australian businessman. His name is I'm just checking out the information here. Mark Kutifani. He was formerly the CEO of the South African gold mining company, AngloGold Ashanti. He held that position from 2007 to 2011. So AngloGold Ashanti is one company dealing with diamonds. AngloGold I'm sorry, De Beers deals with diamonds. It's like, you know, they've got their foot and their fingers in almost all the pudding. The pudding is broad. It's centralized control, in a manner of speaking.
Well, let me tell you the most disturbing thing, Yusuf, is that when you look at Rothschild, you look at the banking industry, we've got what is called fiat money today. And fiat money has no tangible value. It's actually based on debt. Now, the reason this is a huge issue is because if you look what's happening with the global lockdown right now, everybody is going bankrupt because they can't pay their debts. Now, what has Rothschild been doing for the last 200 years? It's been in charge of all these gold mines, and it has been collecting gold, physical gold, which it puts underneath the Bank of England. They've got a huge vault down there next to the Thames River, and it's got tons and tons of gold. So you've actually got real money, which is gold, and of course silver, but they already go off the gold. Basically, the supply of gold is largely controlled by the Rothschilds, who used fiat money, which has no real value, but because they're big bankers are able to do this, to actually take control of real money through the amount of gold that they now own.
Yeah.
And this has been a huge scam.
Yeah.
And of course, the City of London itself is owned by the 1 square kilometre is owned by the Rothschild family. They actually own that banking area where
City
you
of
don't
London.
pay any taxes, and they have their own police force. They've got their own special police force in that 1 square kilometre area. It's very few people know about this.
Well, yeah, you know, the thing is that when you looked at the original currency, the original paper notes, I promised to pay the bearer, you know, so much. That basically, in the classical original sense, it was just simply a certificate or a ticket to indicate that you've got some sort of gold or wealth in a vault of some sort.
Yeah.
But fiat money, those who don't know fiat money, it's a currency, paper money, that is issued by the government, but it's not backed by a physical commodity. And in this country, it obviously cannot be backed by gold or silver because that's been controlled by certain selected families. And so the value of that money is actually derived from the relationship between supply and demand. And obviously, the governments that basically give that out. So all modern paper currencies, the US dollar, for example, the euro, the rand, for that particular matter, is in fact fiat money. And here's the thing, but here's the more disturbing thing is that whilst it isn't backed by a commodity like gold, whilst in certain instances governments can print too much of it, which it can cause inflation, and it gives more power of central bank control of the economy. There's coming a stage when even fiat money is going to go out.
Yeah.
Because what's going to happen now is we're going to have a cashless society. There's talk about having a cashless society where you basically are replacing actual paper money, even paper money, which in itself is valueless, with money that you just simply have in your bank account and is represented by an agent of a card or possibly an app on your phone. You know, you've got a phone where you can transfer figures, and then there's figures in the banks, and these figures are then transferred from one person to another. So what happens at all times is that when you, for example, go and take a loan from the bank, they're not printing any new money, but they're just simply typing figures on a computer screen, and that is then entered into your account. So they're giving out more than actually exists. And so people are being indebted. And then what happens when you can't pay back the debt? What then happens? They come, you get summons served on you, they authorize a warrant of execution, and they take your property away. So that's a greater danger. And with the lockdown that's happening, what's happening now is that people are saying, you do things online. If you want to make purchases, purchase it online. What happens after a time when, for example, the control is of such a level that you can only do things online and electronically, and the electronic system ceases to work for certain individuals? Or, for example, you've got a kink in the system in the sense where certain individuals can pay and some cannot pay. So that's essentially total control of society.
Well, can
So
I
not
just add to
simply
that?
is the
And that
illness
is that
taken away.
the reason they want people to have a chip, this is ID 2020, the reason they want people to have a chip
Yeah.
is because your wealth would be stored on your body on a chip. And every single human being on earth would have this chip, which a lot of people talk about
Yeah.
being the mark of the beast. Now, that is where, again, coming back to this vaccine story, we've done a huge big circle. Look, I could talk for hours with you, Yusuf. There's so much that we could share. But look, we've been talking for well over 2 hours now, so I'm going to take the questions. I've only got 2 questions here for you. I'm going to put those to you now. Mara Faree says, why do government have insurance for vaccine deaths?
Well, why do government have insurance?
Yeah, for vaccine deaths. I don't know anything about this. Maybe you do.
I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure if they have insurance for vaccine deaths. I've never heard of something like that. If it is happening, it is extremely disturbing. But is the questioner stating that the state is being paid? I'm not so sure if that happens.
I'm not sure.
I don't understand. I'm not aware.
Yeah.
I mean, immunization. There's no. If someone dies, there's been lots of. Immunization has caused a large, significant number of deaths. I'm not aware of governments being paid out insurance.
Insurance, yeah.
All I can say is that governments are paid a large amounts of money, or at least invest a large amount of money in vaccination programs. I mean, that's basically happening. I'm not so sure, but I've never heard of insurance debt, so I can't comment on that.
All right. Now, William Siegel has written, Motsepe, brother-in-law of Ramaphosa, is putting up all these 5G masks in the first 3 weeks of the lockdown. I found that quite extraordinary, that he was able to somehow bypass the lockdown and have all these masks put up all over Johannesburg and other places.
This whole thing about 5G, and my take on this is that, because a lot of people are also saying that a lot of the pandemic, and I don't know, I don't have as much information on that to make a comment, but a lot of people are saying that the illnesses that you see in different parts of the world, like Wuhan and Iran for that particular matter, and the United Kingdom, is as a result of setting up 5G sites. Now, it is quite clear, and I have absolutely no doubt in it, that 5G is harmful to humans in the same fashion that 4G, 3G, etc. is also harmful, probably on a far greater level. What I have found surprising is the speed in terms of, and this raises questions. You see, when you have, for example, steps being introduced in society. For example, let's assume you want to build a house or build a facility to assist the community because you feel there's a need. I can understand that.
Right.
When you have a concerted effort to set up 5G masts globally, and then South Africa follows through. I mean, that raises a number of questions. And that's why we've seen situations where individuals have basically burned 5G masks in the United Kingdom, and the fact that basically people have had questions, and you've heard individuals raising the whole notion that there are theories that have basically come up linking coronavirus as being a cover-up for the setup of 5G. I don't necessarily believe that is indeed the case, just simply to set up 5G. That you're going to create a pandemic just simply for the purpose of setting up a technology of 5G. But what I can say is that they certainly some degree of danger with regards to 5G in terms of the radiation levels that are basically happening. The fact that there are a number of theories, and these are again theories in circulation that are basically taking place, that these phone masks that have been set up are affecting, for example, the brain waves in the individuals. mobile connectivity at a time can be used. For example, it's positive, but it can be used in a very dangerous way. There's talk about, for example, operating cars, how 5G will be able to operate cars that eventually takes place. So whilst it may be there as a movement to improve telephone communications and mobile connectivity and works on a higher frequency than 4G for that particular matter, or 3G, I think it comes with certain concerns that an environmental need to be basically raising concerns. I think there's also incentives by government in terms of setting this up. I'm not so sure how much money is in exchange between the parties, but I mean, that on its own is a topic in a debate on its very own. And I've always taken the position that where it's always better where something comes from the state or from authority for that particular matter, you should always be circumspect in terms of the information that you are being told. It's far more easier and far more appropriate to actually look at what's happening at the grassroots level as opposed to taking what you're being told. Because at the end of the day, the state or the governments for that particular matter are not concerned about the welfare of society. They're not concerned about the welfare of people. And so if you have a situation where 5G somehow the other alters the brain waves or causes the increase in cancer, or for example has the ability in terms of having cars operating on a particular frequency in order to prevent accidents for that particular matter, I think we need to be very concerned. We need to be concerned with the rise of AI in society. I mean, I was amazed when you saw that video about the robot soldier.
Yeah.
I didn't know that they had technology of. I mean, obviously knew about robots and artificial intelligence, but I never knew you had robots of that caliber existing in society.
Well, I'll tell you something interesting, Yusuf. I'll tell you something interesting. I was born in 1955, and from what I've heard, the stealth fighter, you know that United States stealth fighter? It was actually first put in production in 1955. But the first people heard about it was the 1980s. That's over 20 years later. You know, there is something very, very strange going on in the world today. We only see a certain level of technology. I think that there's stuff happening like these anti-gravity UFOs. I think they could well be something that has been created here on Earth but we just don't know about it. Now, this is a whole new subject. I don't want to go there because we just don't have the time. What I'd like to close on is I've got a copy of your document for the president, demand to lift lockdown and invalidate the NCC. Now, with your permission, what I'll do is I'll link that document below this video and put it up on the web so people can go and have a look at it or download it and look at it. Are you happy for that to happen?
I'm more than happy. It is available on one of the websites. I don't know the name of the website now, I think constitutionally speaking, but you have my full permission to use that. And what I'll also do is I'll send you a 120-page document, which is the annexure to this letter,
right,
which is the medical advice and the medical data and information surrounding the facade on the lockdown, and of course the entire process being fundamentally flawed and questioning the illegality and the legality of it from a medical point of view and just simply not a legal point of view.
Right. Now, Rian's just asked a question. He says, why is 5G so much cheaper than the other signal strengths? Is that the case?
I don't know. It's possible. I'm not so sure. I can't give you an answer. I think Vodacom in South Africa has. I read reports about Vodacom. I don't know if it. I think in Johannesburg it's already in circulation. I'm not so sure about KZN. But if it's cheaper, and if it indeed is the case, then again it raises a number of questions as to why is it cheaper? Because generally speaking, the more effective and the more quick that the technology works and operates, it's in fact more expensive. I'm not so sure why it is cheaper, if it is, and it would obviously raise questions as to the probably making it available for the vast majority of South Africans. But again, I must say that 5G is something that I've looked at, but I haven't studied anything in detail to make a significantly expert comment on that specific issue.
Right. Well, look, Yusuf, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on our show, for being on our live stream. We've been talking for about 2.5 hours, so, you're a soldier. You just kept going. Is there a message you would like to give to people watching right now, or to people who might watch this video later? Something that, you just would like
Absolutely.
people to know?
I think at the very outset, people need to be aware of the fact that what we are in a new point in our history. I mean, something that we may have dreamt about, or not possibly dreamt about, in terms of which we are now in a situation where, for the very first time, we can realize and begin to see with our own eyes what can actually happen and the dangers that are in place when you have the imposition of an illegal and draconian lockdown or shutdown, which can have the potentiality of leading to a humanitarian crisis. I don't think there are too many people alive that lived during World War II and World War One, for that particular matter, when you had a situation of a global war, but certainly affecting certain segments of society, certain countries, for that particular matter. We are in an age where we have the potential to actually make a choice as to whether we're going to acquiescence and accept the level of imposition of fascism that is being imposed on us on a day-to-day basis, and we can be the gatekeepers of that fascism, where we simply acquiescence and allow the state to take over and control us, or we can stand up and say collectively, regardless of your race, regardless of your color, regardless of your creed, putting aside all our differences, religious or racial or otherwise, or ideological, and say we're not having this anymore. We're going to stand up. We're going to stand up for our freedoms. We're going to stand up for our rights. And we're not going to stand up for the freedoms of a certain selected minority group or a majority group. We're going to stand up for the freedoms of all. And in the South African context, standing up for the freedom and the rights of all, those who have been oppressed, those who are the poorest of the poor in society, to those who are of the middle income, and stand up and create a level of discourse and an awareness that together, if we collectively stand side to side, then we can essentially create an egalitarian society whereby you have a situation that people have the right to their needs, the basic necessities, basic wants are fulfilled, basic freedoms, where children don't have to go to latrines and defecate in the fields, where they do not have to be drowned in latrines, where people have a decent shelter over them. That's what we need to stand up. And we need to become more aware, South Africans, and not be controlled by what the state tells us, and also move beyond the kind of infatuation that we have with social media status, with Twitter feeds, with posting things on Facebook, with what the person says next door, and go beyond that. Move our focus from the insular, fragmented position that we find ourselves in to a far more broader ambit where we can create a just and harmonious and multicultural society for all of us.
Right. Okay, well, I just want to address the people watching right now. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation, by being involved in the side chat. To the moderators, thanks guys, you always do a fantastic job. I've found this discussion absolutely fascinating. I've certainly learnt a few things, and I just want to thank our guest, Yusuf, for spending, well, it's over 2.5 hours now with us. But look, we will certainly get you back on again in the future, Yusuf, if you'd like to come on.
Sure.
Maybe we can
More than a
discuss
privilege.
another subject. But yeah,
Absolutely.
look,
I'd love to.
you obviously know what you're talking about, and I found it very, very interesting, and thank you so much for your time. All right.
It's a pleasure, Scott. Thank you very much. You take care.
Thank you. All right, everybody, look, please take care. And don't forget, tomorrow night, 8 p.m. Johannesburg time, we have another live stream coming up. So please make sure you subscribe to the channel, and that you watch out for 8 p.m. tomorrow night. Watch out for the scheduled live streams that are coming up. And Marlena, thank you so much for the work that you do in that area. All right, guys, take care, and bye for now. Oh,